sort of an overview. So looking at closer, we're going to talk about particle size and soil texture. So soil texture is really the feel of the soil, and it comes from the relative proportions of sand, silt, and clay-sized particles. Particle size is a continuous variable. It runs from when we take a soil sample, we sieve it through a 2 millimeter sieve. So sand starts at 2 millimeters, which is really almost a pebble, down to 0.0, like 5, what does that say? 0.05 of a millimeter. And then silt is the next kind of smaller size class. We chop this continuous variable up into classes. Silt is the next size class. Clay is the smallest size class. The relative amounts of each particle size class that you have determines a soil's texture, and it determines the soil's fitness for growing plants, as well as the chemical properties of those smallest particles, the clay, sort of determine the nutrient and water holding capacity of the soil. Most local soils are clay. Let's see, I'm jumping ahead of myself. So this is the texture triangle, and the texture triangle, what you do is you can figure out the amount of sand, silt, and clay that your soil has, and find it on this texture triangle, and it will tell you what texture of soil you have. So for example, if your soil was, let's do one that might actually happen here. 20% sand and 30% silt. So you find 20, you find 30, and that's right there. Your soil is a clay soil. Most of the soils locally are actually kind of in the clay loam neighborhood here. So there are very few soils in the Livermore Valley that are actually truly clays. So there's a couple different ways that you can actually determine the amount of sand, silt, and clay in your soil. One of them is the mason jar method. I have that right here. What I've done is I've taken about a half a jar full of my soil. I filled it up. I marked it right here. This is going to go up on the website, so you guys can do this at home. I put a little soap in. The soap is a deflocculant, so it makes all of the clay particles repel each other. Just the same way it makes all that grease and dirt shoot off of your dishes like it does in the commercials. It'll make the clay particles shoot away from each other. And so I've shaken this up. In the lab, we use sodium hexametaphosphate, and that's the deflocculant that we used. And then we shake it on like a paint shaker overnight. I just had my husband shake this for a while this morning, so we'll see how it works. And then what you do is you let it sit for 40 seconds, and at the end of 40 seconds, all of the material that's settled towards the bottom, you can actually see it when it's light enough. All of the material that's settled towards the bottom are the heaviest particles, the biggest particles. Those are the sands. You measure how much sand, what percentage sand you have, and then you let it sit for 6 hours, I think. And you measure how much silt you have, because the silt is the next largest particle. It will settle out next. And then if you let it sit for a couple of days, the clays will settle out. And you'll be able to tell the relative proportions of sand, silt, and clay. And then you'll be able to launch Web Soil Survey and sort of check it by the Web Soil Survey. The other thing you can do is soil texture by feel. The NRCS website has this. I have this. And it's in the Master Gardener Handbook if you have that. And you can actually by feel, go through this flow chart and tell what textural class your soil is. So a little bit more about texture. So once you know what texture class you have, that kind of tells you how suitable your soil is as a medium for growing things. Medium textured soils, so basically kind of from here down, are considered the best agricultural soils. These guys are the coarse textured soils. They're very difficult to grow things in. The sandy particles don't hold a lot of waters. These guys are great. These guys are a little bit heavy. We'll talk about how to fix them. It means that they hold a lot of water and they hold their nutrients very tightly. And but don't worry, you're not hosed if you have one of these. So a little bit more about clay. Clay is a confusing term in soil science. It refers to a particle size class, so clay sized particles. It refers to a textural class, so on the triangle, this particle size, this soil right here actually only has 80% clay. It also has some sand and silt sized particles in it, but we still call it a clay soil. Getting ahead of myself. And it's also a mineral type. The particles that tend to be the smallest are a special type of mineral that forms in the soil, clay minerals. They're small, they're plate-shaped, they have a high surface area to volume ratio, and they're negatively charged on their surfaces, which means that they hold cations. Stuff like calcium and ammonia and magnesium stick to them, okay? Important plant nutrients stick to them. We can measure the total, you can almost imagine it like, magnets sticking to a refrigerator. And we can measure the total amount of charge and an ability for a soil to hold those cations. It's called cation exchange capacity. Clay soils, heavy soils that have a lot of clay in them, have high cation exchange capacity, and that means they have the ability to hold a lot of nutrients. It's good news for us because it means that our soils have a lot of nutrients in them. So now we're going to talk about soil organic matter. So soil organic matter are the solids in soil that originate from living organisms, as opposed to the ones that we were just talking about, the clays that originated from the parent material or formed in soil. And the soil organic matter is composed primarily of carbon, as opposed to the mineral part that's composed primarily of silica. So it includes living organisms and plant and animal residues, and everything's in a varying state of decomposition, and some of it's alive and some of it's dead, and it's just really wonderful. So below the surface litter layer, soils vary in their organic matter content. I talked about mollisols a little bit earlier, which are those prairie soils that have a really high organic matter content. Valley soils in so they'll be like 5 to 10% organic matter. That's like in the Midwest, you'll see that. In California, really what you see is normally more like 1 to 2% organic matter. Soils that are heavily cultivated, like in the Salinas Valley, they tend to have, fractions of a percent of organic matter left. What determines the amount of organic matter that you have is the balance between the rate of inputs of organic matter and the rate of decomposition. The reason we have so little organic matter in California is because our rate of decomposition is really high. And then if you go and you plow a soil, you till, you introduce a lot of oxygen, and the biological activity increases, and those critters that are in the soil, they eat up all the organic matter and it oxidizes off even more. So that's why agricultural soils tend to lose their organic matter really quickly. So you hear the term humus. Hummus with 1 M, not 2 M's. Hummus with 2 M's is yummy bean-based dip. So humus is organic matter that's resistant to further decomposition by soil microorganisms. So like a clay mineral, humus humus has a high surface area to volume ratio, and it's charged on its surfaces. So you can even increase the cation exchange capacity of your soil by introducing organic matter, which eventually becomes soil humus. Humus also plays an important role in binding soil particles together and creating soil structure. If you have a structural problem with your soil, for example, my backyard, the soil, if you dig in it, it looks like, and let it sit in the sun, it looks like clinker bricks. I mean, it's so clayey. If you add organic matter, it becomes humus, and that is what can turn those clinker bricks from that gnarly texture for growing stuff into a nice, spongy, soft texture. Humus basically is like, it's stretchy, and so it can help bind soil particles together. It's wonderful stuff.
Isn't that what the worms excrete, is the humus?
Humus is this weird thing. It's hard to define, and it used to be operationally defined. Basically, they would take all these gnarly chemicals and kind of extract humus from the soils using like strong acids and strong bases and stuff. And there was all this work done on humus trying to define it by using all these gnarly chemicals. And there have been some recent papers out that actually say that a lot of the stuff that they defined and were looking at when they talked about humus, when they were looking at soil humus, I always say humus. A lot of the stuff they actually created by the processes where they were using these gnarly chemicals on the soil. They were, the things that they were studying were an artifact of the chemicals that they were using to study them. And so, yes, earthworms poop humus, but they also poop a lot of live stuff. I mean, a lot of that stuff is alive. And they also poop a lot of like, humus is defined as being kind of you would call it a recalcitrant organic matter. It's stuff that's left after decomposition, but there's actually some stuff that earthworms poop that could be decomposed even more. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question? Okay. So there's a lot of living stuff in the soil organic matter, and so the next couple of slides talk about some of that living stuff that's actually, who's actually in there. So soil scientists usually collectively call all the stuff living in the soil the bugs. You can't get rid of the bugs. If you try to sterilize a soil to study it in the lab, you can't. Soils cannot be sterilized. It's because of the way that clays are. There are all these little nooks and crannies for the bugs to get into, and the bugs are really resistant to they will leave their living spores in the soil almost no matter what you do. You can autoclave it, you can bake it, you can do all these things, but if you baked a soil, is it really still soil? If you baked off all the organic matter, not really. So anyway, you can't kill the bugs. A teaspoon of soil usually contains between 100 million and a billion bacteria. What that equates to is an acre of soil has like the weight of 2 cows worth of bacteria in it, of living bacteria. There's a lot in there, and it actually sort of gives the living stuff, like just the volume of the living stuff is really important to soil organic matter. Like when you feel that fluffy black soil, a lot of what's making that soil feel fluffy and black and smell good, it's living stuff. So the bacteria occur in much higher concentrations around roots. We call that the rhizosphere. It's like a little area. It's defined as being a millimeter around the cylinder of the root. Bacteria are found in like 10 to 100-fold higher concentrations right around roots. The reason for that is the plants want them there. They make chemical signals that talk to the bacteria. I'm running out of time, so I gotta go fast. This is a picture of root nodules on a legume. What these are a little house that this clover plant has made for rhizobium, which is a bacteria that takes nitrogen out of the atmosphere and turns it from N2 gas, and it reduces it to ammonia. And that ammonia then goes and fertilizes the clover plant or the pea plant or the bean plant. You can think of nitrogen as equivalent to protein. The reason that why beans are high in protein is because they have this symbiosis with this bacteria. We'll talk about that more in the next slide. There are 4 types of bacteria. The rhizobium is an example of a mutualist. Autotrophs are like us. They eat carbon and excrete CO2. Pathogens, you've all heard of damping off. That's a good example of a pathogen in soil. Or crown gall. That's a bacterial pathogen. That's more appropriate. And then chemoautotrophs. They're really interesting. Plants get their energy from the sun. We get our energy from eating other animals. Chemoautotrophs get their energy from doing chemical reactions that are not photosynthesis and are not just oxidation, not just burning off. Not just combustion. What chemoautotrophs do, one example of something that chemoautotrophs do is they take that ammonia and they turn it to nitrate, and that happens all the time in soil. It's called nitrification. So the nitrifying bacteria make their living by oxidizing ammonia to nitrate. There's a little bit of energy gain there, and they take advantage of it.